The lawyer in a stage of great agitation. He found him modestly seated on the balustrade of a terrace. Your intention of ceasing to reside in Mademoiselle Gamard's house being made evident, began the man of business. Ah! Monsieur, cried the Abbé Birato, interrupting him, I have not the slightest intention of leaving it. Nevertheless, monsieur, replied the lawyer, you must have had some agreement in the matter with Mademoiselle, for she has sent me to ask how long you intend to remain in the country. The event of a long absence was not foreseen in the agreement, and may lead to a contest. Now, Mademoiselle Gamard, understanding that you're bored. Monsieur, said Birato, amazed, and again interrupting the lawyer, I did not suppose it necessary to employ, as it were, legal means to. Mademoiselle Gamard, who is anxious to avoid all dispute, said Monsieur Karen, has sent me to come to an understanding with you. Well, if you will have the goodness to return tomorrow, said the Abbé, I shall then have taken advice in the matter. The quill driver withdrew. The poor vicar, frightened at the persistence with which Mademoiselle Gamard pursued him, returned to the dining room with his face so convulsed that everybody cried out when they saw him, what is the matter, Monsieur Birato? The Abbé, in despair, sat down without a word, so crushed was he by the vague presence of approaching disaster. But after breakfast, when his friends gathered round him before a comfortable fire, Birato naively related the history of his troubles. His hearers, who were beginning to weary of the monotony of a country house, were keenly interested in a plot so thoroughly in keeping with the life of the provinces. They all took sides with the Abbé against the old maid. Don't you see, my dear friend, said Madame de Listomere, that the Abbé Trubert wants your apartment. Here the historian ought to sketch this lady, but it occurs to him that even those who are ignorant of Sterne's system of cognomology cannot pronounce the three words, Madame de Listomere, without picturing her to themselves as noble and dignified, softening the sternness of rigid devotion by the gracious elegance and the courteous manners of the old monarchical regime, kind, but a little stiff, slightly nasal in voice, allowing herself the perusal of La Nouvelle Heloise, and still wearing her own hair. The Abbé Birato must not yield to that old vixen, cried Monsieur de Listomere, a lieutenant in the navy who was spending a furlough with his aunt. If the vicar has pluck and will follow my suggestions, he will soon recover his tranquility. All present began to analyze the conduct of Mademoiselle Gamard with the keen perceptions which characterize provincials, to whom no one can deny the talent of knowing how to lay bare the most secret motives of human actions. You don't see the whole thing yet, said an old landowner who knew the region well. There is something serious behind all this which I can't yet make out. The Abbé Trubert is too deep to be fathomed at once. Our dear Birato is at the beginning of his troubles. Besides, would he be left in peace and comfort even if he did give up his lodging to Trubert? I doubt it. If Karen came here to tell you that you intended to leave Mademoiselle Gamard, he added, turning to the bewildered priest, no doubt Mademoiselle Gamard's intention is to turn you out. Therefore, you will have to go, whether you like it or not. Her sort of people play a sure game. They risk nothing. This old gentleman, Monsieur de Bourbon, could sum up an estimate. provincial ideas as correctly as Voltaire summarized the spirit of his times. He was thin and tall, and chose to exhibit in the matter of clothes the quiet indifference of a landowner whose territorial value is quoted in the department. His face, tanned by the Touraine sun, was less intellectual than shrewd. Accustomed to weigh his words and measure his actions, he concealed a profound vigilance behind a misleading appearance of simplicity. A very slight observation of him sufficed to show that, like a Norman peasant, he invariably held the upper hand in business matters. He was an authority on winemaking, the leading science of Touraine. He had managed to extend the meadowlands of his domain by taking in a part of the alluvial soil of the Loire without getting into difficulties with the state. This clever proceeding gave him the reputation of a man of talent. If Monsieur de Bourbon's conversation pleased you and you were to ask who he was of a Tourainian, a sly old fox, would be the answer of those who were envious of him, and they were many. In Touraine, as in many of the provinces, jealousy is the root of language. Monsieur de Bourbon's remark occasioned a momentary silence, during which the persons who composed the little party seemed to be reflecting. Meanwhile, Mademoiselle Salomon de Villenoix was announced. She came from Tours in the hope of being useful to the poor abbé, and the news she brought completely changed the aspect of the affair. As she entered, everyone except Monsieur de Bourbon was urging Birato to hold his own against Tribert and Gamard, under the auspices of the aristocratic society of the place, which would certainly stand by him. The Vicar General, to whom the appointments to office are entrusted, is very ill, said Mademoiselle Salomon, and the Archbishop has delegated his powers to the Abbé Tribert provisionally. The canonry will, of course, depend wholly upon him. Now last evening, at Mademoiselle de la Blaudiere's, the Abbé Porel talked about the annoyances which the Abbé Birato had inflicted on Mademoiselle Gamard, as though he were trying to cast all the blame on our good Abbé. The Abbé Birato, he said, is a man to whom the Abbé Chapelaud was absolutely necessary, and since the death of that venerable man, he has shown, and then came suggestions, calumnies. You understand. Tribert will be made Vicar General, said Monsieur de Bourbon sententiously. Come, cried Madame de Listomere, turning to Birato, which do you prefer, to be made a canon, or continue to live with Mademoiselle Gamard? To be a canon, cried the whole company. Well, then, resumed Madame de Listomere, you must let the Abbé Tribert and Mademoiselle Gamard have things their own way. By sending Karen. Here they mean to let you know indirectly that if you consent to leave the house, you shall be made canon. One good turn deserves another. Every one present applauded Madame de Listomere's sagacity, except her nephew the Baron de Listomere, who remarked in a comic tone to Monsieur de Bourbon, I would like to have seen a fight between the Gamard and the Birato. But, unhappily for the vicar, forces were not equal between these persons of the best society and the old maids supported by the Abbé Tribert. The time soon came when the struggle developed openly, went on increasing, and finally assumed immense proportions. By the advice of Madame de Listomere and most of her friends, who were now eagerly enlisted in a matter which threw such excitement into their vapid provincial lives, a servant was sent to bring back Monsieur Caron. The lawyer returned with surprising celerity, which alarmed no one but Monsieur de Bourbon. "Let us postpone all decision until we are better informed," was the advice of that Fabius in a dressing gown, whose prudent reflections revealed to him the meaning of these moves on the Turanian chessboard. He tried to enlighten Birato on the dangers of his position, but the wisdom of the old slyboots did not serve the passions of the moment, and he obtained but little attention. The conference between the lawyer and Birato was short. The vicar came back quite terrified. "He wants me to sign a paper stating my relinquishment of domicile." "That's formidable language," said the naval lieutenant. "What does it mean?" asked Madame de Listomere. "Merely that the abbé must declare in writing his intention of leaving Mademoiselle Gamard's house," said Monsieur de Bourbon, taking a pinch of snuff. "Is that all?" said Madame de Listomere. "Then sign it at once," she added, turning to Birato. "If you positively decide to leave her house, there can be no harm in declaring that such is your will." Birato's will. "That is true," said Monsieur de Bourbon, closing his snuff-box with a gesture the significance of which it is impossible to render, for it was a language in itself. "But writing is always dangerous," he added, putting his snuff-box on the mantelpiece with an air and manner that alarmed the vicar. Birato was so bewildered by the upsetting of all his ideas, by the rapidity of events which found him defenseless, by the ease with which his friends were settling the most cherished matters of his solitary life, that he remained silent and motionless as if moonstruck, thinking of nothing, though listening and striving to understand the meaning of the rapid sentences the assembled company addressed to him. He took the paper Monsieur Caron had given him and read it, as if he were giving his mind to the lawyer's document, but the act was merely mechanical. He signed the paper, by which he declared that he left Mademoiselle Gamard's house of his own wish and will, and that he had been fed and lodged while there, according to the terms originally agreed upon. When the vicar had signed the document, Monsieur Caron took it and asked her his client was to send the things left by the abbé in her house and belonging to him. Birato replied that they could be sent to Madame de Listomere's, that lady making him a sign that she would receive him, never doubting that he would soon be a canon. Monsieur de Bourbon asked to see the paper, the deed of relinquishment, which the abbé had just signed. Monsieur Caron gave it to him. "How is this?" he said to the vicar after reading it. "It appears that written documents already exist between you and Mademoiselle Gamard. Where are they? And what do they stipulate?" "The deed is in my library," replied Birato. "Do you know the tenor of it?" said Monsieur de Bourbon to the lawyer. "No, monsieur," said Caron, stretching out his hand to regain the fatal document. "Ha," thought the old man, "you know, my good friend, what that deed contains, but you are not paid to tell us," and he returned the paper to the lawyer. "Where can I put my things?" cried Birato. "My books, my beautiful bookshelves, and pictures, my red furniture, and all my treasures." The helpless despair of the poor man thus torn up as it were by the roots was so artless, it showed so plainly the purity of his ways and his ignorance of the things of life, that Madame de Listomere and Mademoiselle de Salomon talked to him and consoled him in the tone which mothers take when they promise a plaything to their children. "Don't fret about such trifles," they said. "We will find you someplace less cold and dismal than Mademoiselle Gamard's gloomy house. If we can't find anything you like, one or other of us will take you to live with us. Come, let's play a game of backgammon. Tomorrow you can go and see the Abbé Tribert and ask him to push your claims to the canonry, and you'll see how cordially he will receive you." Feeble folk are as easily reassured as they are frightened. So the poor abbé, dazzled at the prospect of living with Madame de Listomere, forgot the destruction, now completed, of the happiness he had so long desired, and so delightfully enjoyed. But at night before going to sleep, the distress of a man to whom the fuss of moving and the breaking up of all his habits was like the end of the world, came upon him, and he racked his brains to imagine how he could ever find such a good place for his bookcase as the gallery in the old maid's house. Fancying he saw his books scattered about, his furniture defaced, his regular life turned topsy-turvy, he asked himself for the 1000th time why the first year spent in Mademoiselle Gamard's house had been so sweet, the second so cruel. His troubles were a pit in which his reason floundered. The canonry seemed to him small compensation for so much misery, and he compared his life to a stocking in which a single dropped stitch resulted in destroying the whole fabric. Mademoiselle Salomon remained to him, but, alas, in losing his old illusions the poor priest dared not trust in any later friendship. In the cité dolente of spinsterhood we often meet, especially in France, with women whose lives are a sacrifice nobly and daily offered to noble sentiments. Some remain proudly faithful to a heart which death tore from them. Martyrs of love, they learn the secrets of womanhood only though their souls. Others obey some family pride, which in our days, and to our shame, decreases. Steadily, these devote themselves to the welfare of a brother, or to orphan nephews. They are mothers while remaining virgins. Such old maids attain to the highest heroism of their sex by consecrating all feminine feelings to the help of sorrow. They idealize womanhood by renouncing the rewards of woman's destiny, accepting its pains. They live surrounded by the splendor of their devotion, and men respectfully bow the head before their faded features. Mademoiselle de Sombreuil was neither wife nor maid, she was and ever will be a living poem. Mademoiselle Salomon de Villenoix belonged to the race of these heroic beings. Her devotion was religiously sublime, inasmuch as it won her no glory after being, for years, a daily agony. Beautiful and young, she loved and was beloved. Her lover lost his reason. For 5 years she gave herself, with love's devotion, to the mere mechanical well-being of that unhappy man, whose madness she so penetrated, that she never believed him mad. She was simple in manner, frank in speech, and her pallid face was not lacking in strength and character, though its features were regular. She never spoke of the events of her life, but at times a sudden quiver passed over her as she listened to the story of some sad or dreadful incident, thus betraying the emotions that great sufferings had developed within her. She had come to live at Tours after losing the companion of her life, but she was not appreciated there at her true value and was thought to be merely an amiable woman. She did much good, and attached herself, by preference, to feeble beings. For that reason the poor vicar had naturally inspired her with a deep interest. Mademoiselle de Villenoix, who returned to Tours the next morning, took Birato with her and set him down on the quay of the cathedral, leaving him to make his own way to the cloister, where he was bent on going, to save at least the canonry and to superintend the removal of his furniture. He rang, not without violent palpitations of the heart, at the door of the house whither, for 14 years, he had come daily, and where he had lived blissfully, and from which he was now exiled forever, after dreaming that he should die there in peace like his friend Chapelaud. Marianne was surprised at the vicar's visit. He told her that he had come to see the Abbé Trubert, and turned towards the ground floor apartment where the canon lived, but Marianne called to him. "Not there, Monsieur le Vicaire, the Abbé Trubert is in your old apartment." These words gave the vicar a frightful shock. He was forced to comprehend both Trubert's character and the depths of the revenge so slowly brought about. When he found the canon settled in Chapelaud's library, seated in Chapelaud's handsome armchair, sleeping, no doubt, in Chapelaud's bed, and disinheriting at last the friend of Chapelaud, the man who, for so many years, had confined him to Mademoiselle Gamard's house, by preventing his advancement in the church, and closing the best salons in Tours against him. By what magic wand had the present transformation taken place? Surely these things belonged to Birato. And yet, observing the sardonic air with which Trubert glanced at that bookcase, the poor Abbé knew that the future Vicar General felt certain of possessing the spoils of those he had so bitterly hated, Chapelaud as an enemy, and Birato, in and through whom Chapelaud still thwarted him. Ideas rose in the heart of the poor man at the sight, and plunged him into a sort of vision. He stood motionless, as though fascinated by Trubert's eyes which fixed themselves upon him. "I do not suppose, monsieur," said Birato at last, "that you intend to deprive me of the things that belong to me. Mademoiselle may have been impatient to give you better lodgings, but she ought to have been sufficiently just to give me time to pack my books and remove my furniture." "Monsieur," said the Abbé Trubert, coldly, not permitting any sign of emotion to appear on his face, "Mademoiselle Gamard told me yesterday of your departure, the cause of which is still unknown to me. If she installed me here at once, it was from necessity. The Abbé Poirel has taken my apartment. I do not know if the furniture and things that are in these rooms belong to you or to Mademoiselle, but if they are yours, you know her scrupulous honesty, the sanctity of her life is the guarantee of her rectitude. As for me, you are well aware of my simple modes of living. I have slept for 15 years in a bare room without complaining of the dampness, which, eventually will have caused my death. Nevertheless, if you wish to return to this apartment I will cede it to you willingly." After hearing these terrible words, Birato forgot the canonry and ran downstairs as quickly as a young man to find Mademoiselle Gamard. He met her at the foot of the staircase, on the broad, tiled landing which united the two wings of the house. "Mademoiselle," he said, bowing to her without paying any attention to the bitter and derisive smile that was on her lips, nor to the extraordinary flame in her eyes which made them lucent as a tiger's, "I cannot understand how it is that you have not waited until I removed my furniture before." "What?" she said, interrupting him, is it possible that your things have not been left at Madame de Listemere's? But my furniture. Haven't you read your deed? Said the old maid, in a tone which would have to be rendered in music before the shades of meaning that hatred is able to put into the accent of every word could be fully shown. Mademoiselle Gamard seemed to rise in stature, her eyes shone, her face expanded, her whole person quivered with pleasure. The Abbé Trubert opened a window to get a better light on the folio volume he was reading. Birato stood as if a thunderbolt had stricken him. Mademoiselle Gamard made his ears hum when she enunciated in a voice as clear as a cornet the following sentence. Was it not agreed that if you left my house your furniture should belong to me, to indemnify me for the difference in the price of board paid by you and that paid by the late venerable Abbé Chapelaud? Now, as the Abbé Poirel has just been appointed canon. Hearing the last words, Birato made a feeble bow as if to take leave of the old maid, and left the house precipitately. He was afraid if he stayed longer that he should break down utterly, and give too great a triumph to his implacable enemies. Walking like a Duncan man, he at last reached Madame de Listemere's house, where he found in one of the lower rooms his linen, his clothing, and all his papers packed in a trunk. When his eyes fell on these few remnants of his possessions, the unhappy priest sat down and hid his face in his hands to conceal his tears from the sight of others. The Abbé Poirel was canon. He, Birato, had neither home, nor means, nor furniture. Fortunately, Mademoiselle Salomon happened to drive past the house, and the porter, who saw and comprehended the despair of the poor abbé, made a sign to the coachman. After exchanging a few words with Mademoiselle Salomon, the porter persuaded the vicar to let himself be placed, half dead as he was, in the carriage of his faithful friend, to whom he was unable to speak connectedly. Mademoiselle Salomon, alarmed at the momentary derangement of a head that was always feeble, took him back at once to the Alouette, believing that this beginning of mental alienation was an effect produced by the sudden news of Abbé Poirel's nomination. She knew nothing, of course, of the fatal agreement made by the Abbé with Mademoiselle Gamard, for the excellent reason that he did not know of it himself, and because it is in the nature of things that the comical is often mingled with the pathetic. The singular replies of the poor abbé made her smile. Chapelaud was right, he said. He is a monster. Who? She asked. Chapelaud. He has taken all. You mean Poirel? No, Trubert. At last they reached the Alouette, where the priest's friends gave him such tender care that towards evening he grew calmer and was able to give them an account of what had happened during the morning. The phlegmatic old fox asked to see the deed which, on thinking the matter over, seemed to him to contain the solution of the enigma. Birato drew the fatal stamped paper from his pocket and gave it to Monsieur de Bourbon, who read it rapidly and soon came upon the following clause. Whereas a difference exists of 800 francs yearly between the price of board paid by the late Abbé Chapelaud and that at which the said Sophie Gamard agrees to take into her house, on the above-named stipulated condition, the said François Birato, and whereas it is understood that the undersigned François Birato is not able for some years to pay the full price charged to the other boarders of Mademoiselle Gamard, more especially the Abbé Trubert, the said Berato, does hereby engage, in consideration of certain sums of money, advanced by the undersigned Sophie Gamard, to leave her, as indemnity, all the household property of which he may die possessed, or to transfer the same to her. Should he, for any reason whatever or at any time, voluntarily give up the apartment now leased to him, and thus derive no further profit from the above-named engagements made by Mademoiselle Gamard for his benefit. Confound her! What an agreement, cried the old gentleman. The said Sophie Gamard is armed with claws. Poor Berato never imagined in his childish brain that anything could ever separate him from that house where he expected to live and die with Mademoiselle Gamard. He had no remembrance whatever of that clause, the terms of which he had not discussed, for they had seemed quite just to him at a time when, in his great anxiety to enter the old maid's house, he would readily have signed any and all legal documents she had offered him. His simplicity was so guileless and Mademoiselle Gamard's conduct so atrocious, the fate of the poor old man seemed so deplorable, and his natural helplessness made him so touching, that in the first glow of her indignation Madame de Listomere exclaimed, I made you put your signature to that document which has ruined you. I am bound to give you back the happiness of which I have deprived you. But, remarked Monsieur de Bourbon, that deed constitutes a fraud. There may be ground for a lawsuit. Then Berato shall go to the law. If he loses at Tours he may win at Orleans. If he loses at Orleans, he'll win in Paris, cried the Baron de Listomere.